everyone, and welcome to our fireside chat here at Capgemini Energy and Utilities. My name is Vito Labate. I'm glad to be hosting our fireside chat today with a couple of our experts from the Capgemini Energy and Utilities practice. Today, we are speaking about new ways of working, and specifically the role of the remote connected engineer in a post-COVID world. It's been said that widespread around the world, remote work initiatives could be here to stay, even after the pandemic has receded for many companies around the world. In fact, if you look back at a report just released by Gartner, 41% of employees are likely to be working remotely, at least for some time during the post-COVID-19 era. And that's up from 30% in the past. And you're seeing a lot of companies making this decision where they are telling their employees that the new policy is to work from home forever and that office centricity is over. So we want to explore this subject, and we have a couple of our speakers here today, particularly from the energy and utilities practice. Paul Haggerty and Scott Keenan are here. Paul, I'll maybe turn it to you first, just to introduce yourself, if you could.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Vito. So yeah, Paul Haggerty. I sit within Capgemini's energy and utilities business. Specifically, I look after our water sector here in the UK across all of our lines of business, covering consulting, systems integration, cloud infrastructure, digital engineering. I've been with the business now for just over 20 years and also have responsibility across our global sector capability team, where we tap into and share our knowledge and experiences from the sector across other geographies.
Very good. Thank you, Paul, for joining us today. And Scott, I'll turn it over to you just for a quick introduction, please.
Hi, Vito. Scott Keenan, and I head up the Capgemini OT cybersecurity team within the UK and Nordics. I head up a team of OT consultant engineers who help companies understand the posture of their OT cybersecurity environment and help them introduce new cybersecurity technologies or ways of working to strengthen that posture. We've worked in numerous industries, oil and gas, energy, distribution, utilities, shipping, anything that's got an OT environment basically, and we've done that on a global basis as well.
Very good. Well, thank you both for being here today. I guess where I wanted to start in our discussion is, we've all heard this. It's been said then that we've seen more innovation happen in the last 4 months in the world than normally we would see in as many years. But this, I guess what I'm feeling is this has to be more than just about the COVID crisis. The question is, are we witnessing a watershed moment in the history of our industry? And I'd like to get your view on that. Paul, maybe we'll start with you, please.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's an interesting phrase to coin, isn't it? Watershed moment. I think particularly for utilities and, in my sector specifically in terms of water, then, the whole shift that's been caused by COVID, the need to work remotely, the ability to people, whether that's from a contact center, or whether that's someone typically managing, monitoring, a physical asset and doing that remotely, is not something necessarily new, but, in a matter of weeks, taking, 200, 300 employees and running a contact center remotely is, pretty defining and pretty seismic in terms of the scale and the shift of that. And I think, is it really a watershed moment? I mean, I think it's certainly for me, it's been one that through necessity has demonstrated the potential of where digital has the ability to work remotely, and some of the value and some of the intelligence that can come from that simply by leveraging what other industries are doing. If you look at oil and gas, aerospace, automotive, where we coined the phrase intelligent industry, that physical and digital world colliding together to provide that ability to manage things remotely and get intelligence remotely. then that's been in existence for quite some time. Where utilities have been slightly more, I guess, cautious or slower in that, kind of approach is, for me, where this challenge we're in just now with COVID has really accelerated that. Utilities businesses are typically heavy industry, heavy engineering organizations. Digital isn't quite the same in those businesses as we've seen in other industries. And I think COVID, in terms of innovation, to your points, Vito, making that shift in days, weeks versus years, right, I think is where, for me, that's really brought home what is probably all, clearly existed, but just not really, as I say, being exploited because there hasn't been the necessity before.
So continuing with you, Paul, then let's unpack that thought, because you mentioned some industries in there, but obviously we want to talk a little bit about energy utilities. What do you observe the behavior to be that companies in the energy and utility space are taking right now? Has digital transformation accelerated for them in ways that they've never seen before, and how?
Yeah, I mean, so maybe a couple of examples, that probably bring it to life the reality of it. So look, the majority of utility organizations are working with circa 90-95% of their people working remotely, working from home. Yeah. There are restrictions in here related to travel, single person working in terms of, operational sites that may have had more than one person operating them. And those restrictions have caused utility businesses to have to adapt. So take a contact center just now as an example. Utilities businesses still have customers that we're dealing with queries, whether that's a billing query, whether that's I've got some sort of interruption to my supply, something that I'm going to have to service. And yet, certainly my clients, on the whole, are fulfilling that service remotely. You, me, working from home, still operating as a customer service contact center agent, and providing that service to the customer in a remote fashion. What's the relevance of that? Well, if I'm able to do that remotely without impacting the quality of the service and the resiliency of the service, and as a business, I'm not necessarily having to incur the costs of the facilities and the infrastructure that that I need to host those 200 employees or whatever it might be, then that changes the way the utility organizations would potentially look at how they would support and service that, as well as make you more attractive as an employer in terms of agility and providing, a better opportunity for employees to work in sort of different ways. Mm-hmm. If I look at the field engineer, taking your point about the differences there, then, typically if I'm going out to a site to operate that site, but I am restricted from that because of the current situation, then how do I get access to that site's information, particularly for that site that's got to meet certain regulatory performance? If the site isn't optimized, could I potentially have a breach or a failure in my, production, my world of water? Could I create a pollution incident? Could I have an impact in terms of the quality of water production? Then if I'm able to do that remotely, and Scott will come onto this where we, it's not new to be able to get into monitoring an asset, monitoring production processes remotely, optimizing a site or changing the configuration of how something operates remotely, then that provides significant advantages because it reduces down on travel time, it provides an ability to provide intelligence and alerting to optimize processes to prevent failure, I'm generally more productive.
Right.
Therefore, if I get more productive, I prevent failures against my assets and I can extend the life of my asset, then for me as a business, then that's of value to me. And that's really where, coming back to your earlier point about the real shift, clients are looking at this and saying, could we run our business for 20 to 30% at a lower cost base, by exploiting what digital can really provide to us, whether that's remote working at a physical level, or whether that's remote working from an intelligent asset operational level. And is that the real potential of what digital could bring to us? You know, that 20-30% reduction in my cost to serve, cost to operate. But, you know, the reason we're talking about this is that that opportunity also brings to some threats where clearly being able to operate something remotely and be able to access something remotely has to be done in a safe and secure way because of the threats and challenges that that presents to ourselves.
Exactly. And that's where I'd love to bring Scott into the discussion to have his perspective. I mean, Scott, based on what Paul was saying, I mean, organizations, they need to be enabled with reliable, safe, secure networks. And, you know, employees need the opportunity to be high performers and have an efficient remote working environment. But like, what is your impression on the level of receptiveness that companies have in the industry today as it relates to remote connectivity of their employees?
Yeah, it's fair to say that that's been probably one of the benefits of this lockdown scenario. Companies are starting the conversation about challenging existing perceptions they have around remote access and the ways they've got of working. You know, as we touched on just there, a lot of the industries that we work with, they're often seen as leaders in the ways of working and adopting and creating new technology. But at the same time, they can often be quite old-fashioned and traditional values of having people going on site, engineer on site to do the upgrades. Although the technology that the companies are potentially using, it can be cutting edge or introducing is cutting edge, the working practices behind it can still be quite old-fashioned. So I've seen a lot of receptiveness from companies who are interested in exploring that. Just because we've always done something one way, why does it have to be like that? What's stopping us from changing it? What are the barriers? And I think anything around that conversation can only be positive.
It makes me think a little bit about, you know, some of the innovations that we all pinned our hopes on, you know, even before the COVID crisis was an issue. We've heard about automation and artificial intelligence as a means of increasing productivity of our employees. But how do you see organizations, have they evolved their usage of automation and artificial intelligence to amp up that productivity even more now in a COVID era?
I think that really does depend on the industry. It varies by industry by industry. If you look at the likes of the automotive industry, they're often seen to be light years ahead when it comes to adopting artificial intelligence, new ways of working, Internet of Things. Compare that to some of the industries that we would traditionally work with, power generation, oil and gas. I'm not seeing too much in the way of artificial intelligence being introduced into these environments just yet. So it really does depend on the industry and where they are within that sort of it's life cycle growth, I would be saying.
Paul, your views?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting just going on Scott's point, I guess. I'll give a customer lens and I guess an asset operational lens, I guess. If you look at other industries, particular, you know, likes of consumer products, retail, banking, where they've, you know, substantially embraced the likes of automation and artificial intelligence. How can I look at patterns of data, customer interactions, drive automated, intelligent, next best decision making? You know, whether that's, you know, inquiries coming into a contact center, or whether that's about transactional someone, you know, buying something. You only need to look at Amazon to get an appreciation of how it links transactions to see what's the next best. Would you like to buy? How was your view on this? Would you be interested in the next best of offer? And then you look at large-scale organisations, the likes of Unilever, you know, that covers multiple geographies, and they've got social media information flooding in. They've got weather information flooding in. They've got supply chain and logistics in terms of stores and fulfillment of the supply chain. How do you drive that vast scale of data and insights and apply an artificial intelligence and automation layer to make decisions and make incremental changes at speed. So if I look at that from a customer lens point of view, because utilities are equally all massively challenged in terms of customer satisfaction. How responsive am I? How agile am I? How quickly am I determined? How can I aggregate up 10 customers that are in a postcode that have some sort of failure to then automatically generate some form of a response that reduces the time that has the impact for that sort of disruption. And that's quite in its infancy in terms of the automation and artificial intelligence in utilities versus, if I say that, compared to consumers. Equally, if I look at, and this is some examples from, as you'll know, Vito, from the report that we just completed in terms of automation and utilities, some of the use cases there. If you look at, I'll pick an example, Heathrow Airport. Heathrow Airport has had massive investment, as you see, in terms of its level of digitization, but it's aggregating information about passenger flows, the availability of their jetways, indeed even to things like border controls where, passport scanning or even now facial recognition, biometrics that's coming in there for that sort of aspects of it. You can see, well, how's that relevant to utilities? Well, if you look at remote monitoring of an asset, visual inspection of an asset, temperature inspection of an asset, vibration of an asset, that information flowing in to generate, a maintenance task or generate an inspection task, or indeed preemptively taking an image of something that usually you would cause a worker to go out and inspect. You could do that automatically now. You could aggregate that data together and go, I've got a pump, it's vibrating, it's looking as though it's going to overheat. Statistically, based on the previous maintenance schedule, that's going to fail in the next 15 days. Please go in and actually conduct a task to stop that occurring, because I'm using artificial intelligence and using the volume of data that's pouring out of these assets to drive that intervention. And the value of that is the asset doesn't fail, the customer isn't impacted, and the asset life is extended, so therefore my capital costs as well as my OPEX costs are actually reduced. But that's, in traditional terms, you couldn't do that in the old analog world because you didn't have the power of the scale and the volume of what digital can provide. And that's what other industries are doing, Scott's point. Oil and gas, automotive, aerospace. There's more intelligence in your car nowadays than, is probably in old school Boeing 737s that existed because of just the value. But that's ultimately to drive an intelligent asset that lasts longer, is more efficient, and clearly doesn't disrupt the customer and meets the regulatory challenges which we're all faced with.
I think what you've described there, Paul, is you've described almost the goal of a lot of these companies. Having all these systems tied into one another, tied into the maintenance schedules, tied into so it's all the information is there at a push of a button. However, in our experience, a lot of the companies that's the goal, but they're still on that journey. But they can see the benefits of getting there. That's the beauty of the conversations that we have. We show them what good looks like and how to get there.
They're seeing the business value. I think it comes down to the business value. If they see it, they're going to adopt it. Scott, we heard Paul actually talk a little bit about it, and you alluded to it as well. The whole IoT edge computing angle is one of the things that we're seeing with energy and utility companies are increasingly adopting these days. Can you elaborate on that? Why is this? Why now? Why is this becoming even more of a popular idea with these companies?
I think it's everything that Paul just touched on previously about they can see what good looks like. They can see the benefits of introducing these new technologies and ways of working, and the potential benefits around speed, scalability, availability, efficiency, etc. And I think that information's out there, and companies are saying, well, Why can't we have that? Well, we want that. Why can't we have it? However, from a lot of the companies that we traditionally work with, there's a bit of a caution there as well. A lot of companies have got to be able to walk before they can run. They're all looking at this new technology. This is amazing, but a lot of, especially in the OT environments that we work in, we tend to work in OT environments that are legacy equipment. Equipment might be 20 or 30 years old. It still works. It does its job. However, it's maybe running Windows NT. It's maybe running DOS even. If you start coming along and either swapping all this equipment out for this new shiny equipment and systems, that's great. It's going to cost a lot of money. Or you upgrade the systems that you have there and start adding on all this other technology onto these legacy systems, and you can cause some real problems with that. So companies are in a bit of a quandary. They know what they want, but they're maybe limited to what they've got to work with at the same time. And Paul touched on something as well. There's a lot more government compliance that's been recently introduced, that companies have now got a duty of care to meet minimum regulations around cybersecurity, around data. You've got GDPR, you've got NIST, for example, and that's driving changes within the industry.
Well, this has been interesting. I mean, we've talked a lot about benefits and advantages, but I wonder if we should, in the thread of our conversation, shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the barriers perhaps that each of you are seeing. Paul, maybe I'll start with you. I mean, what do you see as barriers to success in the environment that we find ourselves in now in business going forward?
I think some of it is probably preconceptions is one of the sets. So what do I mean by that? It's interesting. I mean, Scott talks about a lot of the assets that we have within traditionally the utilities business. I take water as an example. You're dealing with assets from the Victorian ages, and you're talking about digital engineering. How the heck can you be talking about digital engineering when I've got an asset that's 30 years old? I think there's a lot of preconceptions that you could take quite an old legacy platform, an old Allen Bradley PLC, and you could, through edge computing, aggregate that information in a digital format and apply AI to it. That happens. You can do that today. The barrier is not the asset. The barrier is often awareness and knowledge and insight as to kind of what truly is achievable. Not everything has to be a new asset. So I think there's a lot of preconceptions that are behind that, or barriers. I think the other barrier behind it is that in a lot of utilities organisation, crudely, digital has traditionally been viewed as infrastructure, email, data centre, finance, payroll, supply chain. Digital about accelerating capital delivery, digital about, the connected engineer, mobile workforce, doing things in terms of augmented reality to do remote virtual management of an asset. We don't do that in utilities. The mindset that that digital leadership or digital innovation is something that is a barrier there. Utilities businesses are typically hugely talented in engineering innovation, product innovation, but less so in terms of what I would call digital engineering, digital innovation. That world is largely, still somewhat behind in that. And that for me is probably the most significant barrier, is the maturity of digital leadership, the digital intensity, and the recognition that digital is beyond just, the traditional elements of applications, and actually realizing that it is, really the catalyst for actually driving huge value across that end-to-end sort of supply chain.
Scott, I'd be interested in your view on this from a barriers perspective.
So I think from my perspective, there's a lot of, unfortunately, the traditional barriers, and that's always around risks, fears, costs, and obviously an element of your workforce as well. Do you have the suitably skilled resources who understand and can implement this new kind of technology. If we go back to, this about the remote access, when we're helping companies talk about remote access solutions, I always ask a couple of basic questions to look at, why are they doing this? But it's also understanding why are they looking to implement a remote access solution? And one of the barriers is quite often they don't really know. They just know that they want to do it, or they want to allow smarter ways of working, but they've not actually thought it through. Also, one of the barriers is, are they going to be doing this securely? Is remote access going to allow people to connect to the piece of equipment that they have to connect to, or are they going to be able to browse the networks and go into other parts of the company that they shouldn't have access to? A lot of companies in the OT environment, for example, they don't have a good handle on how their network's set up in the OT environment. It's a bit of a black hole. So if you can connect to one system, are they entirely sure that they can stop you connecting to another system elsewhere on the network? Some of the other barriers as well, we talked about the risk. There's also the risk of how do you get around the problem of enabling unknown devices that's not been previously used in your corporate environment. A lot of people have got you bring your own devices. What's the risk around letting somebody whose maybe kids are browsing the internet, doing all manner of things, and then the adult is then going in and logging into your corporate environment and doing some work? Who knows what kind of issues could be lying on that laptop? And to me, there's a lot of the traditional barriers around that. It's just, as I say, fear, risks, and the financial cost, because implementing any kind of remote access technology, it costs money.
Well, I'll tell you what, this is maybe my favorite part. I know we're winding down in our chat here, but my favorite thing I think I wanted to ask you both is about advice. Many of our listeners here are looking for advice in this era as many companies try to emerge from the crisis. But Scott, we'll start with you. What maybe one or two pieces of advice would you give to industry leaders today in this kind of time of disruption that we're going through?
Basically, don't rush to implement a solution without clearly thinking it through first of all. We quite often see a lot of solutions that have been introduced hastily or for simplification, i.e. 4G dongles in the back of systems to allow people the relevant people to get access to it. In theory, that's great. The reality is these are unsecure systems, unsecure remote access that pretty much anyone can get access to. So my first piece of advice was don't rush to do anything. Less rush, more thought about it.
Very good.
The second piece of advice would be to implement a remote access policy that people can refer to, thought through, and that has been agreed by all the stakeholders. So, for example, if you're giving a third-party engineering company access to your systems, spell out what they can do, what they can't do, how it's got to be set up, what the security around must be. How do you know that they're not just going to share the username and password with all the users in their department? No, you set out bit like what we do around IT and other aspects that we do around. You come up with a remote access policy, and it's thought out and it's agreed by everyone. Again, that comes back to just don't rush it. And lastly, when you do implement a secure remote access policy, make sure that you only give, I touched on it earlier on, you only give people the privileges that they're meant to have to the systems that they're meant to have. You don't want people going in there who suddenly have access to areas that they shouldn't have access to, because people are inquisitive, they're meddlers. They might not have bad intentions, but that doesn't mean to say that it won't cause problems further down the line.
Yeah, you don't want them poking around where they shouldn't. I understand. Paul, you work with utilities clients all over the UK and around the world. What are you telling your clients these days as far as advice goes?
Yeah, I mean, I think, similar sort of veins to Scott, I guess. If I looked at it more from maybe reverting to your question, Vito, on barriers, I guess. For me, there's probably three things, because this is all about eventually having something that demonstrates business value, gets business stakeholder buy-in purely. I think if I look at the barrier part to it, and I kind of alluded it to a little bit, is the robustness of the business case. How well, are business cases truly developed that are able to articulate and provide the KPIs and the metrics behind why such a move to remote working, the connected engineer, the connected asset, truly adds value. I alluded that to a little bit about extending the life of the asset, increasing level of productivity, minimizing any form of disruption to a customer that might incur penalties or indeed regulatory penalties if there's an outage or an event. You can usually transcend that into bottom line cash. Yeah, you can bottom line into what that does to your P&L. My asset lasts longer. My people are more productive. I don't have to hire contractors. I don't have a failure, therefore I don't have to incur the traditional costs of, having to either hire equipment to do the repair or indeed the disruption that comes in to do a reinstatement if I'm digging up something to support that. So for me, do not adopt at that front end a light touch approach to what I would call the business case and the metrics. Because if you've got that business case and you've got that metrics, then you've got the foundations to know, going back to my earlier point about getting the buy-in for how fundamentally you can drive a step change in the cost base and in the performance of what your investments are. So that's kind of point one. Point two would be, overly used phrase, start small and scale. I agree very much with Scott about don't adopt a ready, fire, aim approach. Be pretty clear before you put your spade in the ground. Have you thought it through before you do that? But, increasingly what we're doing, certainly in the innovation area, is about minimum viable product, the MVP. There's a difference between an MVP and a proof of concept. A minimum viable product is a product. You're going to use it, even on a small scale. But you're going to get value from using it and then figure out how you scale up and do that in an agile way. Again, engineering organizations are typically more attuned to big bang waterfall transformation. Start small. Just start small with a product and then scale up. Yeah, and then my last piece of advice would be you've got to think about how you're going to actually operationalize this. You're going to be introducing this into a workforce. That workforce is going to be quite diverse in terms of, whether that's in different geographies, rural versus urban working is different. The age demographic that's put in there. How are people going to be able to adopt and operationalize the actual capability that you're presenting to them? Never forget that you've got an end user that is going to have to shift towards that change. So don't just go pursuing the technology agenda. Figure out how you're going to actually operationalize that and help the people on that journey, and to do that successfully, because then you'll get momentum, you'll get buy-in, and it'll ease that path, because there will be resistance to that change. So, business value, MVP and scale up, figure out how you're going to operationalize that. For me, those three key ingredients give you the bedrock of successful change, successful transformation program.
It's a perfect way to end our conversation on this. Paul, Scott, thank you sincerely. It's been a privilege to talk with you and get your insights here going forward.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks. It's been great.
So to our listeners, thank you for listening in. We've been speaking about new ways of working today, the role of the remote connected workforce, particularly in a post-COVID world, and particularly in the utilities industry. I was joined by Paul Haggerty, who is the Vice President at Capgemini Invent in the energy and utility sector, and Scott Keenan, Director of Operational Technology Security at Capgemini. We will be back with you again. In the meantime, thank you for listening and talk to you soon.